This is my real story. My name is Harper Vance. I'm 29 years old, and I'm about to take you through something that still wakes me up screaming in the middle of the night. A story that started with a strange disappearance in my family and ended with me standing over something that should not have been alive. If you think ghosts are scary, you've never met something that can touch you, hurt you, and still vanish into thin air. This isn't some campfire tale. This is exactly what happened to me, and by the time you hear the end, you'll understand why I did the things I did. If you're watching this, make sure to like, subscribe, and share so more people know the truth before it's too late. This story is written and edited by Dark Life Side Diaries. It began when my cousin Allison vanished in the middle of a thunderstorm last November. Hollow Creek, the tiny mountain town where she lived, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and nobody locked their doors. I hadn't been there in years, but the call from my aunt was desperate. "She's gone, Harper. The sheriff says she ran off, but I know she didn't. Please come." I drove 7 hours through freezing rain, my headlights barely cutting through the fog curling over the winding roads. When I arrived, Allison's house was exactly as she'd left. Her phone still on the kitchen table, the kettle boiled dry on the stove, her favorite scarf draped over the couch. The only thing out of place was the back door, wide open, and a trail of wet footprints leading out into the woods. They weren't hers, they were bare, too long, the toes sharp like claws. The sheriff brushed it off, saying it was probably some local kids messing around, but the way his eyes slid away from mine told me he didn't believe that for a second. That night, I stayed at Allison's place, determined to search the woods in the morning. But at exactly 2:17 a.m., I woke to the sound of someone whispering my name from the hallway. It wasn't a normal whisper, it was wet, ragged, like the speaker's throat was full of water. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and stepped into the hall, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The whisper came again, but it was behind me now. I spun around, and for a fraction of a second, I saw a figure crouched at the end of the hall, its hands pressed flat to the floor, its mouth stretching far too wide. Its skin glistened like it was dripping with creek water, and its eyes were nothing but two deep black pits. The beam of my flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, the hall was empty. The next morning, I followed the trail from the back door into the woods, the mud still holding the shape of those strange footprints. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until I realized I couldn't hear the wind, the birds, or even my own footsteps. That's when I saw the creek. Hollow Creek wasn't supposed to be here. I'd grown up visiting this area, and I knew there was no water this deep in the forest, but here it was black as oil, moving slow despite the rain. Something pale bobbed on the surface. I thought it was a log until it turned over, and I saw a face, Allison's face, eyes open, mouth moving like she was trying to speak underwater. I jumped in without thinking, the shock of the icy water stealing my breath, but the moment I touched her arm, she dissolved into nothing but silt and weeds. Then I felt something wrap around my ankle. I kicked hard and scrambled out of the creek, but when I looked back, there was a figure standing waist deep in the water, the same thing I'd seen in the hallway, its grin splitting its face in a jagged line. It raised one dripping hand and pointed directly at me. That night, I learned the truth from an old man at the diner who refused to even say the creature's name out loud. "It takes what it wants," he said, his voice trembling, "and once it marks you, it doesn't stop. You can run, you can hide, but it'll follow you until you're gone, or until you take something from it in return." That was the first time the thought of revenge flickered in my mind. If this thing had taken Allison, if it was coming for me, then I would find a way to take something from it, even if I had to walk straight into the dark heart of Hollow Creek to do it. Days after my first encounter with that thing in the creek blurred together into a sleepless haze of fear and obsession. I couldn't stop thinking about Allison's face in that water, her lips forming words I couldn't hear, in the way that dripping hand had pointed at me as if sealing my fate. So instead of driving back to my apartment in Milwaukee like any sane person would, I stayed in Hollow Creek, renting a room above the diner where the old man had warned me about it. He still wouldn't give me a name, but he did give me one piece of advice. It can't be killed the way you'd kill a man, but it can be made to let go if you give it something worse than what it took. That idea gnawed at me, and every time I looked out at the mist rolling off the forest, I thought of Allison's open, unblinking eyes beneath the surface. So I started asking questions around town, pretending I was working on some local history project so people wouldn't clam up right away. The more I dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't some isolated tragedy. People had been disappearing here for decades, always near the creek, always during heavy rain, their bodies never found, but some folks swore they'd seen their lost ones afterwards, pale and dripping, lingering near the tree line or staring from darkened windows. The locals had stories the Hollow Creek witch who cursed the water after her son drowned, the drowned soldier who came home from war and pulled his family into the current, a water demon that traded human lives for storms. But one story kept coming up from the oldest residents. There was a man named Elias Crowther who lived in the 1800s, a cruel recluse who murdered travelers for their belongings and dumped their bodies in the creek. When he was finally caught, they hanged him on the banks, but the rope snapped mid-drop and his body fell into the water. No one ever saw it resurface. The legend went that Elias didn't die, not really. The creek kept him, changed him, made him into something that could slip through shadows and seep into your home. I couldn't prove any of it, but I could feel him watching me every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. The whispering would start again, sometimes right in my ear, sometimes from under the bed, and once horrifyingly from inside the closet, followed by the sound of dripping water hitting the floor. Though when I looked, it was bone dry. The tension built until the third night when I woke to the sensation of fingers brushing my ankle, cold and slick. I lashed out with the flashlight, the beam catching a glimpse of that wide, impossible grin before he melted back into the dark like smoke. That's when I realized hiding wouldn't work. He was getting bolder, and sooner or later he'd take me like he took Allison. I needed leverage. I started visiting the creek every day, staying until my skin went numb, calling out to him, daring him to show himself. The first few times nothing happened, but on the fourth day I found something strange wedged between two rocks near the bank. Was an old rusted locket, the initials I see engraved on the back. Inside was a miniature portrait of a woman with sad eyes and a little boy who looked eerily like the man I'd seen. I took it, feeling a shiver run through me, like I'd just stolen something important that night. The whispers didn't wait until 2:17. They started the moment the sun went down, and this time they weren't calling my name. They were begging, hissing words I couldn't quite make out but could feel in my bones. Give it back. Instead, I put the locket in my pocket and went to the diner to see the old man. His face drained of color when I showed it to him. That's his anchor, he whispered, glancing around as if afraid the walls might hear. It's the last thing that tied him to who he was. If you've got that girl, you can make him hurt. The idea of hurting whatever Elias had become lit something in me I hadn't felt since before. Allison disappeared hope, but twisted with rage, the old man warned me that using it would draw him closer, make him more dangerous, but I didn't care. That night I lit candles around the room, placed the locket in the center, and waited. The temperature dropped so fast frost bloomed on the windows, the shadows in the corners began to ripple, and then he was there, crouched at the foot of my bed, water pouring from his hair, his grin stretching until his jaw cracked. It's mine. He rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. I forced myself to look him in the eyes, or the pits where his eyes should have been, and said, "Give me Allison." His grin faltered just for a heartbeat before twisting into something uglier. "Trade," he hissed, and in an instant the air was thick with the smell of rotting leaves and stagnant water. Images flooded my head, a figure struggling under black water, hands clawing for the surface, a rope tightening around a neck, the creek swallowing screams. I saw Allison, but she wasn't screaming. She was staring at me, her lips still moving, forming those same words I'd seen in the water. I couldn't understand them then, but now they were clear. "Don't come." I snapped back to the room to find him inches from my face, his breath cold enough to burn. "Trade," he repeated. And then he was gone, leaving only puddles on the floorboards. My hands shook as I picked up the locket, realizing I now had a choice. I could walk away and save myself, or I could find out what he meant and risk everything to drag Allison back. But deep down, I already knew there was no choice. I wasn't leaving without her, and if it meant going into the creek itself, then so be it. I would take something from him, something that hurt, something that made him wish he'd never touched my family. Night I decided to go into Hollow Creek was the first time in days I felt something other than fear. It was sharper, heavier, like a blade I was holding in my own hands, because I knew this wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about ending whatever Elias Crowther had become, even if that meant I wouldn't come back. I packed what I thought I'd need: a heavy-duty flashlight, a length of rope, my hunting knife, a flask of whiskey to steady my nerves, and the locket, which I wrapped in black cloth and tied around my neck, so it would stay with me no matter what happened. And when the clock struck midnight, I left the diner room without telling anyone, following the barely visible deer path through the woods toward that black stretch of water, the air thick with fog that muffled even the sound of my own footsteps. The creek looked different under the moonlight. Wider somehow, the surface unnaturally still like glass over something that wanted to breathe. I stood on the bank, feeling the pull in my chest, the same pull that had kept me in this town instead of running, and whispered his name for the first time. Elias Crowther. The name seemed to sink into the water, swallowed instantly, and for a long moment nothing happened. Then the surface broke in the middle, a pale shape rising slowly until I realized it was him standing on the water as if it were solid, his grin stretching wider as he saw the locket against my chest. "You came," he rasped, water spilling from his mouth. "Trade," I said again, my voice steadier than I expected. His head tilted, and for a second I saw something flicker in those black pits where eyes should be, not pity, but something close to memory. "The door's open," he said, and then the water beneath him split apart like two hands pulling fabric, revealing a darkness that seemed to go on forever. Before I could lose my nerve, I tied the rope around my waist, securing the other end to a tree, and stepped in. The cold was immediate and brutal, but there was no sinking. Instead, it felt like I was being pulled through a tunnel. My body stretched and compressed at the same time until suddenly I was standing on the bank of another creek under a sky that wasn't the same sky I'd left. It was darker, heavier, the stars like pinpricks in a curtain of ash, and the forest here was silent. In a way that hurt my ears, I knew this wasn't the real world. It was his place, his hunting ground. Figures stood in the trees, too still to be human, their faces pale and dripping. And when I looked closer, my stomach turned. They weren't whole, each one missing something, a hand, a jaw, eyes like pieces had been taken and claimed. And there among them was Allison. She was barefoot, her clothes soaked her skin, the same pale shade as the others, but her eyes were still hers, and when she saw me, they widened in a mixture of relief and terror. She shook her head violently, mouthing those same words, "Don't come," but I was already moving toward her when Elias appeared between us, faster than I could blink, his grin splitting into something monstrous, stretching ear to ear until it tore the skin of his cheeks. "You brought my heart," he hissed, pointing at the locket. "And you think I will give you hers?" His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist, the cold searing straight to the bone. But I used the moment. I yanked the locket from my neck and held it over the creek's surface. His grin faltered, replaced by a snarl. "Give her to me or it goes in," I said, forcing every ounce of rage and grief into my voice. The air around us seemed to tighten, the figures in the trees swaying like reeds in a storm, and for the first time Elias looked unsure. "She stays," he growled, but there was no confidence in it. I pushed the locket closer to the water. "Then watch me destroy the only thing you have left of yourself." His scream tore through the air, a sound like metal being ripped apart, and the ground under my feet trembled. In an instant, the figures in the trees began to move, not toward me, but toward Elias, their hands reaching, their mouths opening in silent wails. He turned, snarling at them, and that's when Allison broke free from wherever he was holding her, running toward me. I grabbed her, the shock of her freezing skin nearly making me drop her, but I held on and back toward the place I'd entered. Elias lunged, his claws slicing the air where my head had been a second before, and I threw the locket into the creek. The moment it touched the surface, the water erupted in a column of black spray, and Elias's scream became a roar of pure rage and pain. His form flickered, distorting like smoke in wind, and for a split second, I saw him not as the thing he'd become, but as a man gaunt, terrified, reaching out like he wanted me to pull him free. Then he was gone, swallowed by the churning black. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I pulled Allison with me into the water, feeling that same crushing, stretching sensation as before, until we tumbled onto the real creek's bank. In the freezing night air, she was shivering violently, but alive, her eyes darting to the water like she expected him to rise again. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice hoarse. And I didn't argue. We stumbled through the woods back toward town, the rope trailing behind us like a lifeline. But even as the lights of Hollow Creek came into view, I knew this wasn't over. The locket might be gone, but so was the piece of him that tied him here. And if he was truly the thing they said he was, that might only make him worse. I had taken something from Elias Crowther, and something told me he wasn't the kind to forgive or forget. For the first 48 hours after pulling Allison out of that nightmare place, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. We stayed holed up in my aunt's house with the curtains drawn, barely speaking, both of us flinching at every creak and groan of the old floorboards. And though Allison wouldn't talk much about what had happened to her, I could see the changes. The way her skin stayed cold no matter how many blankets we wrapped her in, the way her eyes seemed to follow shadows in the corners of the room, the way she sometimes whispered under her breath like she was answering someone I couldn't hear. On the third night, I woke to the sound of dripping water, and my stomach dropped because it wasn't raining. The sound was coming from inside the house. I grabbed the flashlight, heart pounding, and followed the steady drip into the hallway, where a small puddle had formed on the hardwood floor, perfectly still like a mirror. I was about to step around it when the beam of my flashlight caught movement inside the water. Not a reflection, but a shape moving beneath the surface, grinning up at me with black, empty eyes. I stumbled back, the puddle rippling outward until it touched the walls, the air going heavy and wet from behind me. Allison's voice whispered, "He's here." I spun to see her standing in the doorway, her pupils dilated so wide her eyes looked completely black, water streaming from her hair. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice overlapping with his, the sound of two people speaking through the same mouth. Before I could answer, she, or whatever had taken hold of her, lunged, and I barely managed to slam the bedroom door between us. Her fist pounded against the wood, each hit splintering it a little more, while a voice on the other side hissed, "You took my anchor. Now I'll take yours." The words chilled me because I realized then that Allison was my anchor, the last real family I had left, and Elias Carter was going to use her to destroy me from the inside out. I had no choice but to fight him here in the real world. I grabbed the salt from the kitchen, a relic from some half-remembered superstition, and poured a thick line in front of the door just as it burst open. Allison froze at the threshold, her head tilting unnaturally as Elias's grin flickered across her face. "Trade," he said again, but this time I laughed, a heartbroken laugh, because I finally understood what he'd been offering all along. A life for a life, but it didn't have to be mine. "You want an anchor?" one said, stepping toward her. With the hunting knife in my hand, "Take this." I slashed the blade across my own palm, letting the blood drip onto the salt line. The air instantly reacting, the temperature dropping until frost crawled over the walls. Elias roared through Allison's mouth, the sound rattling the windows, and I stepped closer, my blood still falling onto the salt. "You had your life taken from you, Elias," I said, voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the storm building around us. "Now I'm taking mine back by breaking yours." With that, I shoved Allison backward out of the doorway and kicked the salt line closed, trapping myself in the room as the puddle on the floor expanded into a black whirlpool. The pull was immediate, trying to drag me under, but I fought it, crawling to the center and plunging my bleeding hand into the water. I thought I'd feel cold, but instead there was fire. Blinding, searing pain as something on the other side grabbed me. I held on, yanking hard, and for a moment it was like tug of war with the darkness itself. Then I saw him, Elias, not the grinning shadow, but the man, broken, terrified, desperate. "You can't take both," he whispered, and I smiled through my tears. "Watch me." I pulled harder, and the whirlpool erupted, flinging me back against the wall. When I opened my eyes, the puddle was gone. The house was silent. Allison was slumped in the hallway, her skin warm for the first time since I'd found her, eyes clear. "It's over," she whispered, but I knew she was wrong because in the back of my mind I could still hear him. Not angry, not screaming, but laughing softly, like he'd been waiting for this ending all along. And maybe he'd found a way to anchor himself to me in a way I couldn't break. But if that was true, then the game had only just begun. Thanks for staying with me through my story. If you believe some things can't be killed, you're right. But they can be hurt, and if they can be hurt, they can be beaten. If you like this story, please subscribe, share it with your friends, and help me make sure no one else falls victim to Hollow Creek.